Hello, and welcome to another episode of Shattered Lives, Reach Ireland's crime podcast for the Irish City Star and Irish Mirror. I'm crime and defence editor Michael O'Toole. Paul Healy joins me. Hello, Paul.
Hello, Mick.
So we are continuing our coverage of the trial of Jozef Puska. Now, today was day 9, and just to recap, Mr Puska is accused of the murder on the 12th of January 2022 of schoolteacher Ashling Murphy on Grand Canal Way in Cappencur in Tullamore in County Offaly. Now, Mr Puska has an address at Lynally Grove in Mucklagh in County Offaly, and he denies the charge. He's on trial in front of a jury of 9 men and 3 women, and the trial judge is Mr Justice Tony Hunt. As I said, this is the 9th day, and Mr Puska denies murder. So, as the last few days, there have been a significant number of witnesses today. I counted 8. Paul was in court today. With the greatest of respect to them, a lot of them would not necessarily be the most important of evidence from a journalistic perspective, we'll put it that way. But there is one witness we're going to focus on today, and that was witness 4, and that was a man called Miroslav Sedlacek. So he was, as I say, he was number 4. So what was his role, Paul?
Yeah, so he probably was the most important witness of the day in terms of his evidence. Again, was the lengthiest, and it is in relation to a lot of the other evidence that we've already heard in the case. So to remind just our listeners that you would have heard, we would have heard in this trial already evidence from members of Garda Síochána who met with the accused man, Jozef Puska, in hospital on the 14th of January 2022, 2 days after Ashling Murphy was killed. And we heard evidence about the interview process that the guards had with Mr Puska and the alleged things that Mr Puska said, including an alleged confession to the murder of Ashling Murphy there and then. And we heard that he was cautioned and all of that. But we heard that that process was done through the facilitation of a translator. And today we heard from that very translator his own direct evidence, and that was Mr Sedlacek.
So just to remind people, Mr Puska is a Slovakian national, and obviously that means that the interpreter would be a Slovakian interpreter, translator.
Yes, indeed. He translates Slovak, as we heard. He lives in Ireland, and the services that he provided to the Gardaí on that day, on the 14th, was all over the phone. So there were 2 conversations between a member of Garda Síochána, Mr Sedlacek, and Mr Puska. And that member was Detective Garda Brian Jennings, who we heard evidence from already. But Mr Sedlacek said he didn't know what Garda he was speaking to, just that he can confirm that he was speaking to the same Garda in both phone calls. So the first phone call was just before lunchtime on the 14th. And I'll get into that in a moment. And then the second phone call was just before 6 o'clock in the evening. And that phone call was a shorter phone call, and that is where the alleged confession was made. But let's deal with the first phone call first. So that was in relation to, Mr. Sedlacek said that that phone call was a 45-minute phone call, and the topic of the conversation, he basically said, was in relation to an alleged assault that happened in Blanchardstown the night prior. So you may recall, the listeners may recall, the allegation of this assault incident in Blanchardstown, and that the guards were at the time investigating an actual assault that had happened. A stabbing incident happened at Blanchardstown shopping centre, and Mr Puska was alleging that he was a victim of a stabbing in the Blanchardstown area, and that's why they went and called to him, and that's why they facilitated this phone call with Mr Sedlacek.
So the first thing he talks about is how he got from Tullamore to Blanchardstown, where the alleged attack happened.
Yes, so Mr Sedlacek said that Jozef Puska was saying over the phone that he basically how he got from Tullamore to Blanchardstown via taxi. Then he told how he got out of the car, crossed the street, and walked, he said, not too far, where he was then attacked by 2 guys who he said were of dark skin. And he said that Jozef could not remember much more detail than that. He couldn't describe exactly, is what he said. And he then
would have said, I think he would have said they're roughly the same height as him, which is about 170 centimeters.
Yes, he said they were about 170 centimeters height and roughly the same height as him. But as we've heard already from the evidence yesterday, Mr. Puska was not able to give a description of the second man and was only able to give a rough description of the first man. And we heard just that the alleged attack happened in near an apartment complex near a field somewhere close to to Blanchardstown shopping centre, and that's what the translator relayed. He said that in terms of Mr. Puska's reason for going out there, he said that he was meeting a girl, and he said that this girl might have been Hungarian. He didn't have her details on his phone. The guards asked for those details, but he said his phone had been stolen in the assault incident, and so he didn't have those details. And he said he'd actually gone home to retrieve those details from his house, and he didn't specify any more details about that lady. He also then, Mr. Sedlacek said that Mr. Puska said over the phone that he suffered bad injuries, that he was knocked to the ground and that he could hardly move. And that was in the alleged assault. And he said that his condition was quite severe. He was also asked by the guards to give a description of his bicycle, the color of his bicycle. And he did that. And at this stage, Mr. Sedlacek was asked about how Mr. Puska was communicating this information and was he doing so freely. And he was asked that by the prosecution counsel, Miss Anne-Marie Lawler, and he said he was speaking freely, sometimes quickly, and he often had to interrupt him just to be able to translate him in live time. And just to explain to people, Mr. Sedlacek said that he wasn't taking word for word notes of what Mr. Puska was saying, but he was taking note of the odd word or two. So we would come back to that in terms of he was kind of cross-examined about particular words that he had taken down. And that was to kind of remind him of the conversation, but he wasn't necessarily referring to those notes as he was speaking to the court today. He was speaking from his own memory of the conversation that he had, and then he would refer to his statement if he needed to. So in those notes, just he referred to his notes about the woman who he said was a friend. Mr. Puska said was a friend, and he also was asked to by Garda to describe the clothes that he was wearing at the time of this supposed attack in Blanchardstown. And he said that he was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, blue jeans and a t-shirt, and that, Mr. Sedlacek, is what Jozef Puska said that he was wearing on the night in question of this alleged incident in Blanchardstown.
And then I think after that, he mentions that he got a cab to Blanchardstown, and there was evidence of that he arrived in Dublin near Houston after getting a lift yesterday, and got a cab to Blanchardstown. And Mr. Sedlacek said in his notes he has the word stabbing circled.
Yes, he had the word stabbing circled, and in reference to that, Mr. Puska had said that he was stabbed in the course of the incident in Blanchardstown. We heard that Mr. Puska had a stab injury to his lower abdomen, and that was observed by the Gardaí. So Mr. Puska's allegation on the phone was that that is how he received that particular stab injury.
Just before, can I just ask one incidental question? Just so we pronounce Mr. Puska's name, it's the interpreter said Jozef, is it? Jozef?
Yeah, it's Jozef Puska. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. So next, I believe they talk about the 6 p.m. call when Mr. Puska is alleged to have confessed to the murder.
Yeah. Now, up until now, the word confession hasn't really been used, but the witness today referred to this as a confession. So he said that this phone call began by Jozef wanting to know, was he a suspect in this case? And that was because a Garda had shown up with a warrant looking for his clothing, for his belongings. And so he asked why they wanted the warrant. And he asked, was he a suspect? And Mr. Sedlacek said that the Garda explained to him, and you could hear this over the phone, that Mr. Puska was not a suspect, that he was as he called it, a so-called person of interest. And he said that Jozef didn't know what that meant. And he asked the Garda to explain that to him. And he explained to him that there was a small difference as a person who is not really a suspect, but a person that the Garda pays attention to, is what he remembers the conversation going as. What followed from that then was that Jozef said to him that he wanted him to translate word for word, basically, what he was going to say next. I'm just going to read out what Mr. Sedlacek said. Mr. Sedlacek actually spoke at a reasonably slow pace, so it was quite, for a reporter like me, it was easy to be able to almost word for word translate what he said, which is great because we can then give you the full quotes as opposed to just paraphrasing. So he said, Jozef Puska, asked me to translate it accurately, exactly. This was still between me and him before I kept on interpreting anything. It was quite spontaneous. Everything came quite quickly. He said, tell him everything exactly as I tell you. Tell him I did it, that I killed her, but please tell him that I didn't do that intentionally. He also said, tell him I didn't want to do it. I'm very sorry that it happened. And then he recalls that Mr. Puska was then cautioned by the Garda, and here he heard that exchange over the phone. So in relation
I think
to
I think the interpreter said that was a standard caution, and he would say that Mr. Puska understood what it meant.
Yeah, he was asked, did Mr. Puska understand? And he said that Mr. Puska did understand what that meant. And he translated to Jozef in relation to that. And he recalls that he said he understood. He then said that Jozef Puska had a number of questions that he wanted to put to the Garda. And then the translator then put those questions to him. So the questions were in relation to, he said, sorry, just before that, he said that there was a question from the guards as to whether Mr. Puska had a solicitor. And Mr. Puska said that he didn't have a solicitor, but that maybe in the future he would ask for one. But at that point in time, they proceeded without a solicitor. And so in relation to his questions, he said Jozef's questions were in relation to the well-being of his own family. And he said Jozef was very concerned about the safety of his family. I know that from his questions. His question was, after I've made this confession, do you think that my family members will be public? So what he meant by that is, would the identities of his family members become known to the public? Mr. Sedlacek recalls that the guard told him that his family members would not necessarily become public, but that his own name, his own identity would become known to the public. And he was also concerned, his other question was, he was concerned that the family of the girl, as he put it, the family of Ashling Murphy, that they might want to take revenge on his own family for what he did to her. And he was concerned for their safety. And the Garda assured him that Ashling Murphy's family were a good family and that they would not seek any revenge, and there would be no dispute of any kind, that there was no danger, there was no threat. So then we came to the confession as such, the alleged confession. And the witness, and I thought this was interesting, was asked about Mr. Puska's demeanour over the phone. And he described a notable change between how he was on the phone in the first phone call and how he was in the one before lunchtime and then the one in the evening. And he said that his voice had changed significantly from the evening conversation. It was quite different from the morning, from the lunchtime. He said after he made his confession, he was quite emotional. His voice was trembling. His sentences were already quite disjointed. He said, I suppose it was as a result of the situation he was in. His voice had changed significantly. He said, I would describe him as being in very low spirits. I would say even desperate after the confession. He again wanted to know if his family were going to be safe after this confession, as he put it, and if everything was going to be all right with them. And that was actually when the Garda told him that there was no threat and that everything would be okay. At that point, Mr. Sedlacek recalls that he was told by the Garda that Jozef didn't feel very well and they were going to terminate the phone call. And he estimated that phone call, on the basis of his notes, was about 20 minutes in length.
So I think the way it usually works is there's direct evidence. So Anne-Marie Lawler, senior counsel for the state, the lead prosecutor, is asking Mr. Sedlacek questions. I think when she was done, Michael Bowman, senior counsel for Mr. Puska, did what we call cross-examination. So he started asking some questions, and I think he raised an interesting one. He said he used the word interrogating.
Yes, he asked him about his statement in which...
Sorry, you know what? I don't like that. I don't like what I said there. I'm going to
What did you say?
I just didn't like what I said about interest, and I just thought it's a bit bollocky. Just let me ask it again. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I think that would have been the end of the direct evidence for Mr. Sedlacek when he was asked questions by Anne-Marie Laura, the senior counsel for the state. So then it was the turn of Mr. Bowman, who's Mr. Puska's own barrister, so he would have cross-examined him.
Yes, Mr. Bowman, senior counsel for Mr. Puska, he began to cross-examine the witness, and one of the issues that he raised was his use of the word interrogate, and that he described it as such as an interrogation. And the witness confirm that he referred to it as such. But at the end of the cross-examination process, when that concluded, the prosecuting counsel, Anne-Marie Lawler, actually got up and asked him just about that use of that word interrogate again. And what did you mean by that word interrogate? She said. And he said, by that, I mean simply like an interview. And he said, as in the word interview in the positive sense of the word is what he meant by the use of that word interrogate, basically, is what he said. Mm-hmm. And then there were a couple of issues that Mr. Bowen raised. So just the guards had allegedly asked, do you know anything about the murder? Can you tell us anything about it? And Mr. Sedlacek confirmed that they had said that. He also asked him about this quote-unquote spontaneous admission. He asked, was there a pause? Does he recall a pause? And the witness actually said yes, he could remember a pause of about 30 seconds or so before Jozef launched into what he termed as a confession. After he learned he was a person of interest, he said he can recall there was some thinking going on. And then Mr. Bowman asked him, can he recall his client saying, tell them I killed her, but I didn't do so intentionally, and that he was sorry. And the witness said yes, that's the way he said it. And he said that he stressed that point, that he was sorry and that he regrets it. He was also asked if Mr. Puska was reminded that he was under caution. And the witness said, well, probably yes. And he said, so you don't know for a fact that he was reminded? And he said, no, but he said intuitively, I would say yes, that he was. I can't recollect exactly. And in relation to that, the witness had said that this was not the first time that he has acted in this manner over the phone with Garda in relation to speaking to someone. And he was asked by Mr. Bowman, well, are you saying then from your experience in dealing with prior incidents like this, that it's more than likely he would have been reminded that he was under caution? And he was saying yes. So that's what he meant by intuitively, but he couldn't say for fact that Mr. Puska was reminded that he was under caution. So we then took a break for lunch, and we came back, and the cross-examination of Mr. Sedlacek actually continued after lunch. And just in relation to that, we went into the subject of, the family whether Mr. Puska being concerned for his family, that there might be an act of revenge. He confirmed all of that. He also asked, can he recall Mr. Puska saying, I am the person that Garda are looking for? And the witness actually said, Mr. Sedlacek said his recollection of this is that Mr. Puska said to him, I will tell you the truth. That's me they're looking for. That's me who did it. So that's his recollection of that conversation. And then he also asked him just about his notes. So there's the word admit and the word murder in his notes. And he said the word murder, he wrote that down after Garda were explaining the warrant to Mr. Puska and about what happened in Tullamore, the murder of Miss Murphy. That's what they were referring to. And then the word admit, he said, comes from Jozef when he was making his admission to him. Mr. Bowman also I guess it was a moment of levity in the courtroom in that it eviscerated a reaction, I suppose, from people sitting in the courtroom. He just asked briefly about Mr. Sedlacek whether he was following the news at all of this trial, and he actually referred to Frank Graney's podcast on this and whether he was following that, and the witness just said no, that he wasn't.
Very good. So that was the end of Mr. Sedlacek, was it, essentially?
That was the end of Mr. Sedlacek. Yeah, as I say, he took most of the day, and that kind of rounds off, as it were, an awful lot of evidence that we've already heard about these interactions with Mr. Puska in the hospital and this alleged confession. There were other witnesses in the morning. I just want to briefly mention a nurse who gave evidence because her cross-examination, I suppose, is worth noting, and that's Miss Rosalind Gillen. So she worked in St. James's Hospital. She was there on the 14th of January 2022. She said that Mr. Puska was originally in a 6-bay bed, and she was involved in moving him to a private room when the guards then spoke to him in this private room. And just Mr. Bowman, in cross-examination with her, asked whether she can recall any member of Garda Síochána asking for a treating physician to ask about Mr. Puska's condition at that point in time, or whether he was fit to deal with any Garda at that moment in time in any capacity. And she said that she was not asked that at all.
And I think in the afternoon there would have been evidence of DNA samples.
People might wonder a DNA that it's obviously of interest, but we're only kind of in the beginning of this evidence as far as we can tell, certainly what was said in the court. So in relation to that, I'm just going to refer to, sorry, I've lost my notes.
Just refer to your notes, as they say in court.
Yeah, in relation to that, we've got Dr. Kim Connick. So she was the first witness, and she is with Forensic Science Ireland, and she's specifically a fingerprint expert. And so she examined 3 items in this case. She said she examined a navy fleece raincoat, a mountain bike, a Falcon mountain bike, a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses with gold frames. She said the raincoat had heavy stains with a blood-like substance on it. She took photographs of it. She chemically treated it, used UV and white light, and another thing another process called superglue fuming treatment to determine whether there was any fingerprints on the jacket, and she found none. She also examined then, as I said, the Falcon Storm bike. So it had a grey frame, bright green forks and handlebars. She was taking photos of it. She had retrieved it from storage on the 13th of January, powdered it, examined it for any marks, and she found 1 mark on the bicycle. She didn't find any marks on the Ray-Ban sunglasses, but they were sent for DNA analysis as well. So that's not her department. In relation to the bike, as I said, she found a mark, and then that would have been passed on then to a colleague. So the next witness then, Detective Sergeant Damien Carroll, he's with the Garda Technical Bureau, and his expertise basically is fingerprints, thumbs, and palm prints. And so he told the court that on the 18th of January, he carried out his own analysis of the bike saddle of this bike. So we'd heard that the fingerprint that was found on the bike was on the saddle underneath it. And it was kind of accepted by the previous witness that it would be typical that you would probably find a fingerprint on that particular part under the backside of the saddle, because a person might typically lift their bike up. So that's where it wouldn't be unusual as such to find a fingerprint mark there. So he carried out analysis on that. He did a 1-to-1 comparison using a magnifying glass. And then on the 19th of January, he already on the 18th had a set of fingerprints from Jozef Puska that had been taken from Mr. Puska. On the 19th, he got a second sample. He used that sample then to identify the mark on the bike saddle, and he determined that there was a correlation between the two. And he said that he was in no doubt that the print on the bike saddle was also Mr. Puska's.
And so the next witness after that was a man called John Hode, who I believe was in Forensic Science Ireland at the time.
Yes, he's now retired, has a significant amount of experience, the court heard, and he is a DNA expert and working with Forensic Science Ireland. And we heard briefly that he dealt with swabs that were taken from the fingernails of Ashling Murphy. This is what I'm saying. We may come back to that. But in relation to today, we're speaking about the bike. And so he was involved in the analysis of handlebars on the bike, and he got a full DNA sample from that. Excuse me. He was then tasked with just seeing he found a full DNA profile from the bike. He then had 2 other samples that were taken from Jozef Puska. So there was a DNA sample and then a blood sample that had been taken from him in James's Hospital, and he examined all 3 and determined that they were all a match with one another. They all matched with one another, and there was a lot of scientific mumbo jumbo as such. Was very hard to describe here, but ultimately the ultimate point that he made was the chances of any of these samples belonging to anyone other than Jozef Puska would be 1 in a billion. So he determined that So that's the blood taken from Mr. Puska, the DNA, and then the DNA on the bike, that they were all a match to Jozef Puska.
Okay, so then the final witness was Detective Sergeant William Delaney.
Yes, Detective Sergeant William Delaney was initially on the stand to confirm his involvement in the execution of the in obtaining the warrants that we've heard about in the case, and one of the warrants being the warrant that was used to obtain the belongings from Mr. Puska, and he would have obtained that from a judge in the CCJ. We then just briefly heard of his involvement in setting up what's kind of known as an ID parade, where there are a number of people lined up as potential persons of interest, suspects in the case. And we heard that one of those individuals is a Romanian national who was by the name of Radu Florisiel. And Radu Florisiel had a solicitor with him, we heard, as part of this parade, and he was picked out in the lineup. We heard evidence about this previously, but we didn't refer to it in the podcast the other day. It's just so much material. But Jenna Stack, listeners may recall, was one of the key witnesses in this case. And she is the lady who saw a man on top of Ashling Murphy, and believed that she was being attacked. And she was the lady who went to then alert other people to what she saw. She ultimately chose Mr. Florisiel, this Romanian national, as being the man she saw, and Mr. Florisiel had been chosen because he had matched the general description that had been given by Miss Stack, and then Miss Stack went on to identify him as being the man that she saw. I would also just point out that it has been heard by the court that Miss Stack, she saw a man on top of Ashling Murphy, and that the defence accepts that that man was Jozef Puska, but Jozef Puska is saying that what Jenna Stack saw is not what she believes she saw, and that he was actually trying to assist Miss Murphy at the time. But just Mr. Sergeant Delaney was pointing out that he was involved in that ID process with Mr. Florisiel, and at that point in time, he had been identified as matching the general description that Jenna Stack gave.
Okay, so he was the final witness. Now there were, as said, we haven't gone into great detail, or we haven't really mentioned, there were two witnesses earlier before Rosalind Gillen, is it?
Yes.
The lady from the hospital. And they were Detective Garda Owen Maher and Garda David Henry. And they both were basically talking about CCTV evidence. Is that right?
Yeah, CCTV evidence. This is just in relation. There were two clips that were shown to us quite briefly, and you see two women, a woman running, a woman in pink, and they are identified by the Garda witnesses, in their opinion, as being Jenna Stack and Aoife Marin. And we've heard about their evidence already. There were two houses that the CCTV were taken from. One of them was at Digby's Bridge. There, it's called Digby House, and then another private residence. Some of the footage was better than others. They did admit that some of the footage wasn't great, in that the figures that we're dealing with in the footage were quite far away. But yeah, relatively simple evidence to sum up, I suppose. And that was just at the beginning of the day.
Okay, so that's us for the day. Really, that was the sum total of the evidence. Really.
That was it.
Okay.
Yeah, we're back at 12 o'clock tomorrow, so it's starting a little bit later tomorrow. Lucky for you, because you're going to be there.
I might have a lie-in.
Yeah.
Okay, just before we go, some news for both of us, I suppose, really, or the third leg of this pod, who we very rarely see, but who is instrumental to it. It's Kieran Bradley.
He's going to have to come on now.
He's going to have to come on now, so he always sits in the background and tells us when we make mistakes, which is quite often, unfortunately. But this is Kieran's last pod, so I mean, and Paul can speak for himself, but I certainly want to thank Kieran. He has been absolutely wonderful, and even on a personal level, this whole pod has really invigorated my journalism. I have to say, it's really given me an awful fantastic boost, and that's all Kieran's fault. And he keeps me in the Healy sort of civil, but he has to witness an awful lot of guff off air. So Kieran, thanks very much for all your help, and we're very, very grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Kieran, who I hope is listening, but if he's not, he will hear this. Yeah, it's hard to sum up, but there he is.
There he is. Yeah, hello, Kieran.
I'm not going to be on the audio, unfortunately. So
okay.
Well, just thank you to Kieran Bradley. He's been a fantastic producer and has brought this pod to new heights. you know, we appreciate all the people that have listened, but it's the great production and the editing in this, and you don't see behind the scenes the amount of editing and work that does go into it. And he's also been a great referee between me and Mick, as Mick has mentioned. And yeah, he's a nice lad, so we wish him all the best in his future, and I'm sure no matter where he goes, he will do so successfully. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for listening again.